was happening? So check this out. I haven't made a DriveTime video in a while, and I thought it's about time. A little overdue, actually. More or less, I haven't uploaded one in a while. Lately, I've been thinking a lot about certain subjects. Of course, they have to do with psychology and personal development. One of the big ones I've been thinking of is the word, it's more from a Freudian time of psychology and analytical psychology and Carl Jung and that whole era. But it's the word neuroses, and which, you know, is how would you define neuroses in layman's terms? I'm just thinking now. I mean, there's a clinical diagnosis of neuroses, but it is a mind disease, if you will, an ill way of thinking. But something I've recognized, and that a lot of people don't realize, is that a neuroses is the body's or the mind's attempt to heal itself when it is out of balance or experiencing a cognitive dissonance, which is cognitive dissonance defined, again, layman definition of when you know something's right or you have a specific belief, but you're acting in a way that conflicts with that causes a cognitive dissonance in your mind. And so when things like this happen, often in relationship issues, when you're with someone you really love and care about, for example, but they're not treating you properly, and you know you should leave the relationship, you know you should leave the relationship, but you don't leave the relationship for other reasons, you start to have these bargaining chips, and you get cognitive dissonance. This is where addictions come into play the same way. And this is a form of neuroses. And because of the neuroses, or the stress, or the anxiety, or the depression, or the anger, or the addiction, all these things are the body's, physiologically, the mind and body's way of trying to reach, physically homeostasis, and mentally, I call it mental, psychological homeostasis as well. So I've been really researching a lot into this, and something I'm on the brink of discovering or reading more into is, many psychologists talk about childhood trauma being a reason for a neuroses. Well, the reality is that an adult, and this comes from Carl Jung, an adult does not experience the same neuroses as a child, even though the adult's neuroses is established as when the adult was a child. It's not the same as he or she grows up. So a child experiences one traumatic event and starts to cope subconsciously and consciously with that event and develops a neuroses. Now, because of that neuroses, that child develops other ways of dealing with events that happen later on in life. Further, as Scott Peck in The Road Less Traveled talks about, most people have layered neuroses on top of neuroses. So you have these layers of psychological diseases, if you will, and you just get buried. And a lot of therapists like to revert back to that initial childhood trauma that caused it. And I think there's a real element of healing there. But Carl Jung talks about moving forward and looking forward and creating new habits and creating new things that essentially leave the neuroses behind. If you think about the way the mind works, modern neurology studies and mind science talks about neuroplasticity and the idea of changing your brain, kind of rewiring your brain by firing neurons, as they say in that community, that neurons that fire together, wire together. So if you think about a dirt road in the middle of a prairie, right, where there's nice compacted soil and it's fertile and there's plenty of flowers and foliage growing on the ground, and you just take a four-wheel drive truck and you drive right through it nice and slow and you press down all the flowers, you're going to see that track through that prairie. Now, if you drive that track every day, it won't take long at all, just a matter of days before that path is hard compacted in tire ruts, and you can clearly see that path, that tire, that road, that dirt road now through the prairie. Now, if you do this for years, it will compact the soil towards almost like asphalt. It's compressed really hard in the tire ruts. Nothing or very little will grow in the median between the tires because the bottom of the vehicle continues to beat and rub over it. So everything that does grow is small and scrubbed. So now you have a defined road. So imagine going a few months or even a few years, let's just say a decade, without driving. After a decade or so of driving on that road or that dirt road or that path, you might still be able to see, because the soil was so compacted in those tire ruts, you might still be able to make out the makings of a road. Even though there is new foliage grown up and some major trees in the median, but that hard compacted soil where the tires went, it's going to be very hard for new growth to happen there because it was so used and compressed by the tires. But nonetheless, that's where you will actually be able to see the tire tracks, because that's where less is growing. So that's where you'll be able to make out that old path, right? So make the analogy to your brain and the neurons in your brain. Point A, point B, dirt road between it. You don't use it for a long time, then that pathway, that neurological road, starts to overgrow and doesn't really become used that often. Here's the thing with, and you create new paths, right? So that's Carl Jung's idea of looking forward and creating new paths at the same time, not using the old, quote, neurological roads in your mind and letting them kind of grow over. Here's the thing about it though. Those old ways, those old neurological connections are like bad habits, if you will, or old ways of thinking. They're always there, and that's why we have memories, because those neurological connections still exist even though they're overgrown and not really used. So think about this. What happens when you go back down a dirt road that hasn't been used in years or months? Okay, it doesn't take long before just 2 or 3 trips down that old road you can barely make out but still see, just 2 or 3 trips, and it's almost like it was never abandoned, right? So it's very important to, once you develop new habits, to make those new habits, if you want to create new healthy habits in place of the old habits. The analogy is in place of the old dirt roads in your mind, the old neurological connections. Okay, you need to continuously reinforce and drive over and make the connections of the new thought process. The second you go back to the old thought process, you instantly reinforce it, probably tenfold to what it would, much faster than the new road can be paved, or developed. And so when you think about it in just a nutshell of what I said, developing new habits, new ideas, and an overall new way of thinking that differentiates old habits, old pain, old trauma, old healing, cyclical, toxic relationships, or anything of the sort, to a new healthy way of living. It's important to continue that new healthy way of living as often as possible and as strict as possible. That alone will develop the neurological pathways. But what happens is if you revert back to the old way of thinking just once or twice, it re-solidifies those neurological pathways that are already established that you're trying to get overgrown with abandonment, if you will. So anyways, I hope this makes sense. It makes sense to me. I like the dirt road analogy. That's something that, I came up with, trying to process an easy way for me to understand and explain this, especially to my younger kiddos. But, I think it works, and it's a pretty simple way to look at it, and it makes perfect sense. So if you think that is something you resonate with, or it's a good description of it, I'd love to hear about it. Constructive criticism is always good. It's important, I think, to keep this at your forefront, because I don't think there's anyone that doesn't want to change something. And so when you think about this analogy, it really kind of takes out the how on a simple level. Of course, there's much more difficult, context to deal with some people and why they can't make changes. But in a nutshell approach, create new habits, even write them down if you have to. I think writing down brings things into existence. One more step from your mind. Now it's on paper. Now you can see it, read it. You can actually touch the words, and then you implement that, and then it becomes reality. This is one of the awesome capabilities of human beings, is to take a thought and actually logically and quite simply, almost instantly, start manifesting it into reality. You know, just a simple thing like writing it down, or imagining a sculpture and then bam, creating it with a piece of clay or something. You've brought it into fruition in a minor way, and then further meditating on this idea or this concept or this circumstance even, or this object, can bring it actually into existence. It's one of the awesome powers that we have as creators. Anyway, that's a good little Friday message. You should feel empowered by it. I do. I like to think about it often. Have a great weekend. Leave a comment below, subscribe, and we'll talk to you next time.